Kate Falcha, welcome to Irish Granny Helen. Welcome if you're a new subscriber. I'm very grateful to you. Thank you. And if you're a returning subscriber, you know how grateful I am that you continue to come back for more. That's wonderful. Thank you. Be sure to hit the subscribe button, the bell, all the things. Also, if you might want to give it, let me take these stupid things off. You might want to consider becoming a member here on YouTube for 99 cents. And also, I have a Substack. For people who've tried to get to Substack and have had a problem, don't use your phones at first. Go to a laptop and go to the website and enter it that way. You don't have to pay or anything to have access. It's like a forum, and there are millions of people who write and produce other kind of content. Each has their own particular name. So once you find the website and you get into the website, you search the particular name, and mine on Substack is Ask Your Irish Granny. And with that in mind, I take questions to give advice, kind of like Dear Abby, all anonymous. I also put out little essays that I write and videos that I can't put here. Sometimes videos that I have put here to share over there. But you might dig around there. You might find something that entertains. In the meantime, if you're familiar with the work that I do here, I often I'll use the word led. I often get led to a topic just out of the ether. And there is a topic that has been torturing me lately, keeps returning to the front of my mind and insisting on being paid attention to. So we're going to take a little look at the psychologist, psychoanalyst, Carl Jung. I remember vaguely studying him in school, and in one ear out the other. When you're young, you don't retain things that don't necessarily resonate for you until you're ready for them. So I guess I must be ready for it. So I've been researching Carl Jung. Now I'm going to do a little presentation about him in general, his life, and then later, next week probably, or the week after, we're going to dig into more of his theories. So let's talk about Carl Jung. He was born July 26, 1875 in Switzerland. He was the third child after the birth of two stillborns, and after a live birth of a brother, Paul, who died at only a few days old. So he was a bit of a miracle in the eyes of his parents. His grandfather was a professor at a medical school. His father was, on the other hand, a poor rural pastor. His mother was the youngest child of a churchman, like another pastor, and an academic who was a professor of Hebrew and taught Carl at university. So his father-in-law knew him. Carl's mother was an eccentric. I don't know if we'd use that word these days. She suffered from depression. She saw spirits in her room at night. She spent a lot of time alone, locked in her room by her own volition. Nobody put her there. She chose to isolate herself there. Jung said she was strange and mysterious at night. And I think it's important to remember that circadian rhythms affect people's mental state. And if you have a proclivity to some sort of mental health issue, it can become worse at night. It certainly happens for people with, example, Alzheimer's dementia. However, Carl Jung himself was given to an open-mindedness about things paranormal. I'm sure that his lack of the common resistance of people of his status, his academic status. It was his resistance was weakened a little bit. He was less likely to reject the idea because of what he saw with his mother. He said he once saw a faint luminous figure with the head off and floating coming out of her room. I don't believe there have ever been questions about his stability. So this is what he claims he saw. His mother was hospitalized when he was a child for a short time, and he was sent to live with his aunt. And this, for short periods of time, this happened over and over. His mother was in and out of care, and he was back and forth to his aunt's. And it happened at a very formative period in his childhood. And he grew up a man who regarded women as unreliable. And he associated his father with being reliable and being powerless. He could depend on his father to be there, but his father didn't seem to be able to bring about effective change in his family. Jung later admitted that these were the handicaps that he started off with. That's basically a quote. He eventually moved past these early attitudes towards male and female, but one wonders sometimes. When his father got transferred for work, remember he was a pastor, his mother was happy about it because the new job his father had moved them closer to her family, and her mental health improved. At 9, his 9-year-old, his sister was born, Gertrude. They were very close. She later became his personal secretary. Jung was a solitary and introverted child. Like his mother, in a way, he felt that he was two people. Even as a child, he felt he was two people. This modern child, a product of the period of time in which he lived, but also somebody from the 18th century, a dignified, authoritative, influential man from the past. It's very interesting. He had odd amusements as a child, and then they give an example of it, and I was having a hard time picturing it, so I'll describe for you what they wrote in his biography. And I don't know if there's a picture of it anywhere. He got a ruler, like a ruler, 6-inch ruler. He had a pencil case. He got a ruler, and he carved the ruler into a little mannequin. And then he had a painted stone, and he put the two things in this pencil case and hid them in the attic. And he would return to them periodically and leave notes with them, for them, in a secret made-up language. So, yeah, I guess that is odd. Later, he said that this felt to him like a ceremony, like a ritual. It provided him with inner peace and security. So later on, as an adult, he had all these theories, which we are going to discuss, and he correlated this act as a child to totems of indigenous cultures. Especially, he pointed to Aboriginal cultures of Australia, who told stories about soul stones, and he felt a connection to that, although as a child he didn't know about that. He believed it was intuitive when he was a child, an unconscious ritual similar to the ceremonies far away that he really knew nothing about. He was later inspired to make observations about archetypes, which we will talk about. The collective unconscious, and all of it, he claimed, derived or was related in some way to these childhood activities. At the age of 12, he was pushed around by a boy at school and thrown to the ground, where he obviously he hit his head, I suppose, and lost consciousness. And after this, he fainted every time he tried to walk to school or tried to sit down and do homework. Yeah, I used to get nauseous. No. No, this was a real thing. This became a problem, and they took him out of school and kept him at home for 6 months. But one day he overheard his father speculating that perhaps Carl had epilepsy and would never be capable of supporting himself. And he looked around and saw the poverty that his family lived in because his father was this poor preacher. And he recognized that if he didn't want to be like that as an adult, he was going to have to achieve academic excellence to find a way out. Started going back to school without fainting. He immediately, and I like this, he immediately began to study Latin grammar. And he fainted 3 times while beginning to do this, but pushed through it, prevailed, and he said that later as an adult, he looked back at this time and was able to, from that, understand what a neurosis was. Kind of his own laboratory study animal. He thought that he would become a Christian minister because all the clergymen in his family. He really wanted to study archaeology, but he didn't have the money for that. They could afford for him to go study theology or whatever, but it would have cost more for whatever reason to go study archaeology. As a teen, he was really interested in philosophy and decided, I don't really want to be a minister. So he went into psychology and medicine instead. He liked the combination of the biological sciences and that mental, spiritual, he equated spiritual aspect of psychology. In 1895, he attended the University of Basel in Switzerland to study medicine, and a year after that, his father died and his family became destitute. But relatives stepped in and helped the family and gave him money to continue his education. There was a family myth. Nobody is for sure what this was all about. But it's worth mentioning because this was their little glimmer of association with higher class or fame or celebrity. He told his friends at school that his paternal grandfather was the illegitimate son of Goethe. Whatever. He became interested in paleoanthropology and the evolution of past humanity. And he believed that the psychology of humans contained an ancient evolution, layers from early fossil hominids. Now, I'm saying this, my sources didn't say this. I think this is really interesting because what this triggers for me is the notion that maybe he's trying somehow to get to the idea of epigenetics. We'll talk more about this. In 1900, he moved to Zurich to work at a psychiatric hospital, and he worked with a guy called Eugene Bleuler. I can't pronounce the name. And Eugene worked with Freud. So Jung got to know Freud, and they had a very interesting relationship. Jung's dissertation was, and this is the name of it, on the psychology and pathology of so-called occult phenomena, based on the mediumship of his cousin, Helene Price work. All these names are really hard for me. Most of them are Swiss, and they're difficult to pronounce, so I apologize. His cousin claimed to be a medium, His mother claimed to have all these spiritual encounters. He himself thinks he saw something. It inspired him to study those sorts of phenomena as psychological manifestations, and eventually evolved into his theories, which really, I think, why I became interested in him, as I've heard him mentioned quite a bit in a lot of the books I've read recently here on the channel. People make reference to him all the time because he was this very interesting mix of science and spirituality, science and psychology and psychopathology, and it's an interesting field. Anyway, he became a lecturer in the medical faculty of Zurich University. He was very well respected as a man of science and academics. In 1909, he began private practice and was really a close associate and friend of Freud. They traveled together to give lectures. They both went to the United States to speak at Clark University in Massachusetts. There's a whole lengthy description of all these speeches he gave around Europe and United States. He was known and respected in psychological circles. And he and Freud had a friendly relationship that eventually morphed because they diverged from each other in professional opinion. And it got sensitive, which we'll talk about later, and very interesting. He separated from Freud around the same time about the ideas that Freud had. He moved towards the ideas of William James, who's called the father of American psychology. So, and we'll talk about the ways in which his opinions changed and how misrepresentation affected public opinion about him even today. He had an interest in mysticism, spiritualism, and psychical phenomenon, and Freud was not about that. Freud was all about sexual stuff, as we well know, Freud's theories. William James wrote that he liked Jung and maybe not so much Freud, which is interesting. James died within a year of them meeting, but he had a lot of influence on Jung. But Jung continued to cooperate and work with Freud. In 1912, he published a work, and it really diverged their opinions. He wrote The Psychology of the Unconscious. And like I said, this really fractured their relationship. They were both very stubborn and weren't willing to listen to each other's opinions. That was 1912. 1913, World War I started, and Jung made a huge psychological transformation. He was strongly affected by this. He had an intense period of what he called creative illness. Freud would have called it neurasthenia or hysteria. I think lay people may have referred to it as a nervous breakdown. I think we would just call it a period of anxiety and depression. And I'm not diagnosing anything. I'm just grasping for relatable terminology. Neurasthenia is, a very old-fashioned term. It's really not, I don't think it's considered a thing anymore. In 1903, so back 10 years previously, he had married a woman named Emma Rauschenbach, and she was the daughter of a wealthy industrialist. Her father owned a very expensive watch manufacturing business, Swiss watches, very, very famous and high-end, expensive. And so when her father died, Emma became a shareholder in the company. And this provided Carl Jung with something he had never had: financial security, just guaranteed. They were well off. Emma became his assistant, and eventually she became a psychoanalyst herself. They had 5 children. So she was something else, because of course, she had money. So. She died in 1955. Jung had a couple of affairs with patients, which is really, questionable. It's a little unsure, a little uncertain who and how many and when, so we'll just leave that. Freud influenced him, Kraft Ebing influenced him. Freud tried to appoint Jung his crown prince and successor, and tried to make him the International Psychoanalytic Association head in the place of Freud. And there was pushback. There was objection. It wasn't that they didn't like Jung. They didn't like Freud's presumption that he could just hand over the crown and scepter, as it were. So they came to a compromise, and Jung was elected to a 2-year term. So as everybody knows, it's become kind of part of our culture to throw terms around from Freud. He was all about sexual development. That was his theory. And Jung was more about the collective unconscious, which really actually kind of resonates more with people in philosophy and New Age and spiritual sorts of pursuits and metaphysical. Jung believed that memories and ideas were inherited from ancestors. Well, that is essentially epigenetics, the idea that our forebears went through experiences that were imprinted in their genetic makeup, and that they passed those on. So Freud and Jung, their whole entire friendship just fell apart just because of professional disagreements. They both dug their heels in. Jung liked this idea of collective unconscious due to what he considered the ubiquity of archetypes over space and time. And we will talk about this because this is pretty interesting. And I would argue that we see that even today. Well, I don't, because I don't particularly care for that genre. But if you want to talk about archetypes, you don't have to look any farther than the comic book movies that they make, Batman and Superman and those sorts of things. There's a connection. Freud rejected Jung's ideas. It was all about other parts of the body for him. He called it Jung called what Freud said a resounding censure. So they were really mad at each other. Jung had a near psychosis. He called it a confrontation with the unconscious. He started hearing voices and having visions. It gives one pause about his family and genetic predispositions. But it's also interesting how, for him, it did not become a crippling affliction that negatively affected his professional or his family life. He actually drew from this experience. So he had this near psychosis, during which he wrote what he called his Red Book. Now, this was a collection of 7 volumes of personal diaries. They were finally, for the first time, partially published in 2009, but finally included in their entirety in 2020 in a collection of work of his, including all these journals, all of them published as the Black Books. And he had a plethora of publications that I won't go through all of it. They're famous. They're taught in schools. He spoke in London in 1913, and of course this was interrupted by the war, but his ideas spread. And after his brush with psychosis, he began to induce hallucinations on purpose as a process of what he called active imagination. He was very interested in shamanic rituals, and he got interested in psychotropic drugs as a means of attaining a higher state of consciousness. He got drafted as an army doctor. He became the commandant of an internment camp for English soldiers. Keep in mind now, he's Swiss German, so he would be imprisoning English soldiers. But Switzerland was neutral. They had these soldiers. They weren't really fighting the war, but they had to do something with these soldiers. They kept them in this camp. But Jung was actually, if you had to be in an internment camp, you'd want Carl Jung to be in charge. He encouraged them to take university courses, and he provided the access to these imprisoned guys. They were lucky. He traveled and lectured extensively in the 20s and 30s in Europe, the United States, Africa, India, and he cherry-picked from many shamanic, cultural, religious, philosophical belief systems, things that often were ignored by Western psychology, Western science. He studied the indigenous of New Mexico, and he studied the Bantu. He liked their, I guess their kind of their mantra, which was, "I am because you are." That's a quote. He was really into that. In India, he studied Hindu philosophy, and he got very sick in India. It didn't say why. Could have been any number of things, but he returned to become a professor at the University of Basel again in Switzerland. In 1943, he had a heart attack and he retired from teaching, but he continued to publish. In 59, he wrote an interesting publication called Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the sky. And I don't know, it talked about archetypical meanings and possible psychological significance of UFOs. So I imagine that we would find a connection there between what he wrote, what Zachariah Sitchin wrote about, what Jacques Vallée wrote about. I'm not saying they would necessarily agree about everything, but there would be an intersection of their thoughts. He died in 1961. Now, let me see here. Okay. He was greatly influenced by his classical education. All that Latin can only be good for you. By his family's religion, because they were Reformed Protestant theologians, and they were very much affected by that in his daily family life. And with their interest in the occult, like I said, they were more open-minded than a lot of people about this. His father's dedication to academic discipline. Remember when he overheard his father concerning the possibility that Jung would never be able to support himself because he couldn't go to school. His father put a high priority on education and the discipline of academics. It's really affected Jung. And his family, of course, liked to connect to Goethe. So he was financially secure because of his marriage. This was new. His family of origin was so poor. He had global recognition and he traveled so much. He was very well known and respected. He was associated with thinkers in many diverse disciplines. And I decided I could have given you a list, but why belabor the point? Suffice it to say that he was respected across a lot of areas. He was very knowledgeable, very well informed about philosophy. He was really into Plato and spirituality, and he liked to be considered a man of science, which is an interesting juxtaposition. So I think I'll stop here. Yeah, that's a good amount of time. I'm going to stop here, and I will be back in the very, very near future to talk more about Jung and his major concepts and theories, and we'll make some correlations with our zeitgeist today. So let me know what you think. Let me know what you think about this, and thank you very much for listening. And Slán go fóill. Slán.